Officer Holt, was it authority you abused or fear you try to hide? Judge Graves' voice silenced the courtroom. What happens when arrogance meets justice? Can confidence alone stand against the weight of the law? It was a typical Monday morning in the Stonebridge County Courthouse, a place where justice moved at its own deliberate pace. Inside, rows of spectators filled the benches, their expressions a mix of boredom and curiosity as they waited for the next case to unfold. At the front, behind a polished wooden bench, sat Judge Eleanor Graves. She wasn't one to demand attention. Her presence alone commanded it. With decades of legal experience, her reputation was built on fairness, resilience, and a razor-sharp intellect capable of slicing through even the most convoluted arguments. People respected her not because she sought their approval, but because she didn't need to. Every word she spoke carried undeniable weight. The day's docket was routine, a minor public disturbance, a few property disputes, and one case involving an officer accused of excessive force. Nothing particularly headline-worthy. Then, the courtroom doors swung open. Officer Ryan Holt strode in with an air of self-assurance, so thick it was almost tangible. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his steps measured and deliberate, each one exuding the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze landing on Judge Graves. She acknowledged him with a slight nod, her expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time she had seen a rookie officer enter her courtroom with a chip on his shoulder. It wouldn't be the last. But something about Holt's demeanor set off a quiet alarm in her mind. He was too confident, too sure of himself for someone so early in his career that as the morning cases proceeded, the tension in the room thickened. Holt's case had drawn enough concern to land before Judge Graves. When she finally turned to his file, her lips pressed into a firm line. "Officer Holt," she began, her tone even but unyielding. "This courtroom is not your training ground. I expect you to show the appropriate respect for these proceedings." Holt's smirk widened, a thin veil of politeness barely masking the arrogance beneath. "Of course, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." But there was an edge to his voice, a subtle defiance that did not go unnoticed. The real fireworks, however, had yet to begin. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Officer Holt stood at the defendant's table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His attorney, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, leaned in to whisper something, but Holt barely acknowledged him. His gaze remained locked on Judge Graves, a flicker of challenge in his eyes. "Officer Holt," she repeated, her voice steady, "you are here to answer charges of excessive force during an arrest. The evidence includes body cam footage, eyewitness testimony, and a medical report on the individual involved. Do you understand the gravity of this matter?" Holt tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe this is a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. I reviewed the footage myself, and I'm confident I acted well within protocol." A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Graves tapped her gavel once, restoring silence. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though she remained composed. "This court will determine whether your actions were within protocol, Officer Holt. That is not your decision to make." Instead of backing down, Holt leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "With respect, Your Honor, I know my job. Sometimes, situations require quick thinking and a firm hand. People outside the field don't always understand that." A wave of unease swept through the courtroom. His tone was unmistakably arrogant, and the spectators exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves. Judge Graves' expression remained unreadable, but her grip on the gavel tightened slightly. "Officer Holt," she said, her voice now cold, "this is not a debate. This is a legal proceeding. I suggest you adjust your attitude accordingly. Your behavior will strongly influence how this court perceives your authority." For a brief moment, Holt hesitated, as if weighing whether to push further. Then, with an exaggerated shrug, he leaned back in his chair, his smirk never fading. But Judge Graves had seen his type before, and she had no intention of letting arrogance override justice. It was a typical Monday morning in the Stonebridge County Courthouse, a place where justice moved at its own deliberate pace. The wooden benches were lined with spectators, their faces a mixture of boredom and curiosity as they waited for the next case. At the front, seated behind the polished mahogany of her bench, was Judge Eleanor Graves. She was not one to demand attention. Her mere presence commanded it. Decades of legal experience had earned her a reputation for fairness, resilience, and an incisive intellect that could cut through the most convoluted arguments. People respected her not because she was loud, but because she didn't need to be. Every word she spoke carried weight. That today's docket was fairly routine. Some minor public disturbances, a few property disputes, and one case involving an officer accused of excessive force. Nothing that would make headlines. But as the session began, the courtroom doors swung open with a sharp creak, and the officer in question, Ryan Holt, strode inside. Fresh out of the academy, Holt's uniform was crisp, his posture rigid with the kind of confidence that was impossible to ignore. He paused at the entrance, scanning the room, his eyes briefly locking onto the judges. Graves acknowledged him with a simple nod, her expression unreadable. This was not the first time she had seen a young officer enter her courtroom with a chip on his shoulder, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But there was something about Holt's demeanor. His steps were too assured, his gaze too defiant for someone so early in his career, that as the morning proceedings continued, the tension in the room thickened. The details of the case against Holt were read aloud. He was accused of using unnecessary force during a routine arrest. Though the suspect's injuries were minor, the incident had raised enough concerns to warrant judicial review. Judge Graves lifted an eyebrow as she glanced over the case file, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Officer Holt," she began, her tone firm but measured, "this courtroom is not your training ground. I expect you to show the appropriate respect for these proceedings." A smirk tugged at the corner of Holt's lips, barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of politeness. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." But there was a sharpness in his voice, a subtle challenge that did not go unnoticed by the judge or anyone else in the room. The real fireworks had yet to begin. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Holt stood at the defense table, his hands loosely clasped before him. His attorney, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, leaned in to whisper something, but Holt barely acknowledged him. His attention remained fixed on Judge Graves, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Officer Holt," Graves continued, her voice steady, "you are here to address allegations of excessive force during an arrest. The evidence presented includes body camera footage, witness testimonies, and a medical report on the individual involved. Do you understand the gravity of this matter?" Holt tilted his head slightly, his smirk returning. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this seems like a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. I reviewed the footage myself, and I believe I acted well within protocol." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Graves gave a single, deliberate tap of her gavel, restoring order. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her composure remained intact. "This court will determine whether your actions were within protocol, Officer Holt. That is not for you to decide." Rather than retreat, Holt leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "With respect, Your Honor, I know my job. Sometimes, situations require quick thinking and a firm hand. People outside the field don't always understand that." A wave of tension rolled through the room. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable, and quiet murmurs passed between the spectators. Judge Graves' expression remained unreadable, but her grip on the gavel tightened slightly. "Officer Holt," she said, her voice now colder, "this is not a debate. This is a legal proceeding. I suggest you adjust your attitude accordingly. Your conduct will greatly influence how this court perceives your credibility." For a moment, Holt hesitated, as if weighing whether to push further. Then, with an exaggerated shrug, he leaned back in his chair. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, though the sarcasm in his tone was undeniable. Judge Graves turned her attention to the prosecutor, who began laying out the case in meticulous detail. Body camera footage was played for the court, showing Holt's interaction with the suspect, a young man accused of petty theft. The video revealed an unnecessary escalation of force, with Holt resorting to aggression before the suspect had a chance to comply. When the footage ended, silence hung over the courtroom. Judge Graves shifted her gaze back to Holt, her expression stern. Officer Holt, how do you explain your actions in this video? Holt straightened in his chair, his confidence unshaken. Your Honor, as I said before, sometimes you have to make split-second decisions. The suspect resisted, and I acted in the interest of public safety. If I had hesitated, someone could have gotten hurt. The judge raised an eyebrow. Could have gotten hurt, or did someone get hurt as a result of your actions? Holt opened his mouth to answer, but found himself at a loss for words. The gallery watched in anticipation, waiting for the judge's next move. But Holt wasn't ready to back down yet. Judge Graves leaned back in her chair, allowing the pause to stretch just long enough for its weight to settle over the room. Officer Holt, she said calmly, what you've just given is a justification, not an explanation. There is a crucial difference. The purpose of this proceeding is not to evaluate your instincts. It is to determine whether those instincts were lawful and aligned with your oath as an officer. Let me ask you again. How do you explain the injuries sustained by the suspect? For the first time, Holt's confidence wavered. He glanced at his attorney, who gave him a small, cautious nod. He exhaled sharply. I was assessing the situation in real time, he said, his voice less assured now. It's not always black and white, Your Honor. Judge Graves' gaze remained steady. No, Officer Holt, it is not black and white. But the law is clear. And your badge does not give you the authority to blur those lines for convenience or arrogance. A hush fell over the courtroom, so profound that even a whisper would have felt deafening. The smirk that had once graced Holt's face was gone, replaced by a look of frustration he couldn't quite conceal. His hands fidgeted slightly, a stark contrast to his earlier bravado. The judge turned back to the prosecutor. Proceed with the next piece of evidence. The prosecutor introduced a witness, someone who had recorded the incident on their phone. The witness described the encounter as unnecessarily aggressive, stating that the suspect had appeared cooperative before being forcibly taken to the ground. As the testimony was read aloud, Holt's face reddened. His earlier confidence had begun to fracture. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Holt shook his head, unwilling to concede. He shifted in his seat, his posture tense. Judge Graves addressed him once more. Officer Holt, what you are facing here is more than an accusation. This is a question of integrity, of whether the authority entrusted to you was misused. Do you understand the responsibility that comes with wearing that badge? Holt hesitated. His eyes met hers for a moment, as if considering her words. But his pride still clung to him like armor. Yes, Your Honor. I understand. The judge's gaze did not waver. I hope you do. Because the actions in that footage do not reflect an understanding of responsibility. They reflect something else entirely.